Sheriff Marcus Blake had seen countless missing person cases cross his desk during his 43 years in law enforcement, but nothing had prepared him for what lay hidden beneath the granite walls of the abandoned Copper Ridge mine in October 2020, when a small, weathered backpack bearing the name Jennifer Walsh emerged from a sealed shaft that hadn't been opened since 1981. The discovery would unravel one of Colorado's most haunting mysteries and reveal a truth so extraordinary that it would challenge everything the town of Millbrook thought they knew about the day 27 children vanished without a trace. 40 years earlier, the faded Disney princess backpack contained items that shouldn't have existed, items that pointed to survival, hope, and secrets buried deeper than the mine itself. But how had this single piece of evidence survived 4 decades in complete darkness? And what did it mean for the families who never stopped searching for answers? Sheriff Blake couldn't have known that this discovery would lead him down a path where he'd uncover not just the fate of those missing children, but also expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, involving classified military experiments gone wrong, and a cover-up that had silenced an entire community for nearly half a century. The backpack was just the beginning. But who had the power to make an entire school bus disappear? And why had someone gone to such extraordinary lengths to bury the truth? The morning of March 15th, 1980, had started like any other spring day in Millbrook, Colorado, a town nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, where everyone knew their neighbors and children walked to school. Without fear, the cherry blossoms were beginning to bloom along Maple Street, and the air carried the crisp promise of warmer days ahead. But by sunset, that same day, 27 elementary school children would be gone, their yellow school bus number 47 vanishing, as if it had been swallowed by the earth itself, leaving behind only tire tracks that ended abruptly at the edge of Copper Ridge Road, where the asphalt met wilderness. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh had been standing at her kitchen window that afternoon, waiting for the familiar rumble of the school bus that would bring her 8-year-old daughter Jennifer home from Millbrook Elementary. As she always did, Eleanor had prepared Jennifer's favorite snack chocolate chip cookies still warm from the oven, and a glass of cold milk. The routine had never varied in the 3 years since Jennifer started school. The bus arrived at exactly 3:45 each day, and Jennifer would bound down the steps, her blonde pigtails bouncing as she ran up the garden path, eager to share stories about her day. But on March 15th, 3:45 came and went, with no sign of the familiar yellow vehicle. Eleanor checked her watch, thinking perhaps she had been mistaken about the time. But as the minutes ticked by, her concern grew into worry, and then into something approaching panic. She called her neighbor Margaret Collins, whose son Tommy was also on bus 47, but Margaret hadn't seen the bus either. By 4:30, Eleanor was pacing her living room, her heart pounding as she dialed the school office, hoping for a simple explanation. Perhaps the bus had broken down, or there had been an unexpected delay that would account for Jennifer's absence. The voice that answered the phone belonged to Principal Harrison, and Eleanor could hear the strain in his usually cheerful tone as he tried to explain that they, too, were trying to locate Bus 47. The driver, Ralph Morrison, was a 20-year veteran of the school district, known for his punctuality and careful driving record. He had never been late, let alone failed to complete his route entirely. Principal Harrison assured Eleanor that they were investigating and would call her the moment they had any information. But even as he spoke those words, Eleanor could hear the uncertainty in his voice, the barely controlled fear that something terrible had happened. Within an hour, the parking lot of Millbrook Elementary had become an impromptu command center. As frantic parents arrived, demanding answers, police cars began arriving shortly after 5 o'clock, their red and blue lights casting eerie shadows across the playground where 27 children had played at recess just hours earlier. Sheriff Jim Dalton, who would later become Sheriff Blake's predecessor, took charge of the initial investigation, his weathered face grave as he tried to maintain order among the growing crowd of desperate families, each parent clutching school photos of their missing children as if the images might somehow bring them home. The initial search efforts were massive and immediate. Every available law enforcement officer in 3 counties was mobilized to search the mountainous terrain surrounding Millbrook. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras swept across the wilderness, while search and rescue teams combed through dense forests and rocky ravines that could have concealed a school bus. National Guard units were called in to assist with the search, bringing heavy equipment and specialized personnel. Trained in disaster response, the operation continued around the clock for 6 weeks. But despite the thousands of man-hours invested and the sophisticated technology employed, the search teams found nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, no trace of the bright yellow bus that had simply vanished into thin air. The investigation revealed troubling inconsistencies that only deepened the mystery. Security cameras at a gas station 3 miles from where the tire tracks ended showed bus 47 passing by at exactly 3:20 that afternoon, but the timestamp showed the bus was traveling in the opposite direction from its normal route, heading toward the mountains rather than back toward town. Ralph Morrison had radioed dispatch at 3:15 to report that all children were aboard and accounted for, but the transmission was his last communication with the outside world. The radio itself was found 2 days later, smashed against a tree half a mile from where the tire tracks disappeared, but there was no sign of the bus or its occupants. Federal authorities arrived within 72 hours, taking control of the investigation and immediately classifying much of the evidence under national security protocols. The FBI field office in Denver issued statements about potential terrorism or kidnapping scenarios, but provided no concrete evidence to support these theories. Local law enforcement found themselves shut out of their own investigation as federal agents conducted interviews and searches without sharing information even with Sheriff Dalton, who had initiated the response. The sudden federal involvement struck many in the community as suspicious, particularly when agents began asking questions about nearby military installations and classified research facilities that most residents didn't even know existed. The families refused to give up hope, organizing their own search parties and hiring private investigators when official efforts seemed to stagnate. Eleanor Walsh became the unofficial spokesperson for the families, using her background as a former newspaper reporter to keep the story in the media and pressure authorities for answers. She organized vigils, prayer services, and annual remembrance events that drew attention from across the nation. But as months turned to years, the media attention faded and the case grew cold, relegated to dusty file cabinets and conspiracy theory websites that speculated about everything from alien abduction to government cover-ups. Dr. Robert Chen, a geology professor at Colorado State University, had been studying the Copper Ridge area for his research on mineral deposits and underground water systems. When the children disappeared, his detailed maps of the region's cave systems and abandoned mines proved invaluable to search teams. But even his expertise couldn't explain how an entire school bus could vanish without leaving any trace in such well-documented terrain. The limestone caves in the area were too small to conceal a vehicle, and the abandoned mines had been sealed decades earlier as safety measures. Yet Dr. Chen's research would prove crucial 40 years later, when mining operations resumed in the area and workers made the discovery that would change everything. The Copper Ridge mine had been sealed in 1981, just 1 year after the disappearance, following what officials claimed were safety concerns about unstable tunnel structures. But local miners who had worked the site for decades disputed this explanation, arguing that the mine was structurally sound and profitable. The sudden closure cost the town dozens of jobs and dealt a significant blow to Millbrook's economy, adding to the trauma that the community was already experiencing from the missing children. Many residents suspected that the mine closure was connected to the disappearance, but without access to the sealed tunnels, there was no way to investigate their suspicions. Mining company records from that period were mysteriously incomplete, with key documents reportedly destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1985 that investigators determined was accidental, but which many in the community viewed with suspicion the same. Federal agents who had taken over the missing children investigation were reportedly seen at the mine site in the weeks before it was sealed, but when questioned about their presence, they claimed it was part of an unrelated environmental assessment that required no public disclosure. The combination of sealed records, federal secrecy, and the convenient timing of various accidents and closures created a perfect storm of suspicion that would simmer in Millbrook for decades. Eleanor Walsh never stopped believing that her daughter was alive, somewhere waiting to be found. She maintained Jennifer's bedroom exactly as it had been on March 15, 1980, with stuffed animals arranged on the bed and school clothes laid out as if Jennifer might return at any moment. Eleanor's husband David tried to convince her to move on, to accept that their daughter was gone. But Eleanor's determination never wavered. She spent every spare dollar on private investigators, psychics, and search efforts that took her across multiple states chasing leads that invariably led nowhere. But she refused to give up hope, even when the marriage couldn't survive the strain of their different coping mechanisms. The 27 families formed a support group that met monthly in the basement of Millbrook Community Church, sharing their grief and keeping each other's hope alive. As the years passed, some families moved away, unable to bear the constant reminders of their loss, while others like Eleanor dug in deeper, becoming fixtures at town council meetings and school board hearings, demanding that the case remain active and that new leads be pursued. Whenever they emerged, the group maintained a memorial fund that offered rewards for information leading to the discovery of the children. But despite numerous tips and alleged sightings over the years, no credible leads ever materialized. Sheriff Marcus Blake had been a rookie deputy in 1980. Assigned to crowd control during the initial search efforts, he watched Eleanor Walsh transform from a grieving mother into a relentless advocate for justice, and he promised himself that if he ever had the authority to reopen the case, he would do everything in his power to find answers for the families. When he was elected sheriff in 2018, one of his first acts was to create a cold case unit, specifically tasked with reviewing the Bus 47 disappearance using modern investigative techniques and technology that hadn't been available 40 years earlier. The decision to resume mining operations at Copper Ridge in 2020 came after environmental assessments indicated that new extraction techniques could safely access previously unreachable mineral deposits. The mining company Apex Industries had purchased the rights to the property and invested millions in equipment and personnel to begin operations, but they were required to conduct a thorough survey of existing tunnel systems before beginning new excavation work. It was during this preliminary survey that workers made the discovery that would finally provide the first concrete evidence of what had happened to the missing children. On October 12, 2020, mining engineer Carlos Rivera was leading a team through the sealed sections of the mine using ground-penetrating radar to map tunnel configurations, when the equipment detected an anomaly in what should have been a solid rock wall. The readings suggested a void space behind the barrier that was much larger than anything shown on historical mine maps. When the team carefully breached the wall, they discovered a hidden chamber that had been deliberately sealed and Concealed with such skill that it had remained undetected for nearly 4 decades, the chamber contained evidence that would shock the investigators and finally begin to answer questions that had haunted Millbrook for 40 years. The small Disney princess backpack was found near the entrance to the hidden chamber, its bright pink fabric faded, but still recognizable. After 4 decades in the darkness of the mine, the name Jennifer Walsh was clearly visible on the identification tag, written in Eleanor's careful handwriting. When Sheriff Blake received the call from the mining site, his hands trembled as he held the bag, knowing that this single piece of evidence would either provide the closure that families desperately needed or open new wounds that might prove even more painful than not knowing. But inside the backpack were items that would challenge everything. Investigators thought they knew about the case and point toward a truth so extraordinary that it would take months to fully understand its implications. Sheriff Marcus Blake stood at 6 feet 2 inches, with silver hair that had once been dark brown and eyes the color of Colorado granite that had seen too much sorrow over 4 decades in law enforcement. But it was the quiet determination in his weathered face that set him apart from other officers who might have given up on cold cases long ago. Marcus had grown up in Millbrook, watching the town transform from a thriving mining community into a place haunted by unanswered questions and unresolved grief, where families still locked their doors at night and parents drove their children to school, rather than trust any bus service that had attempted to resume operations in the years following the disappearance. Every morning, Marcus began his day with the same ritual that had defined his adult life for 20 years. He would drive slowly past the memorial garden that the families had created on the corner of Maple Street and Pine Avenue, where 27 small oak trees grew in perfect rows, each one planted in memory of a missing child. The brass plaques bore names, dates of birth and photographs that showed gap-toothed smiles and bright eyes full of promise that would never be fulfilled. Marcus would park his patrol car and spend 10 minutes walking among the trees, reading each name aloud, as if speaking to old friends who deserved to be remembered, not just as victims, but as children who had loved Saturday morning cartoons and ice cream and bedtime stories. The weight of the unsolved case had shaped Marcus in ways that even his wife Sarah couldn't fully understand. During their 35-year marriage, she had watched him carry the burden of those missing children like a physical load that grew heavier. With each passing year, Sarah often found him in his study late at night, surrounded by files and photographs and evidence boxes that officially belonged to the department, but which he treated as sacred artifacts that held the key to bringing peace to 27 families who had never been allowed to properly grieve, because hope and uncertainty are cruel companions that make closure impossible. Marcus had been 23 years old when the children disappeared, fresh out of the police academy and assigned to the Millbrook Sheriff's Department, because his father wanted him to start his career in a quiet mountain town where the most serious crimes were usually drunk driving or domestic disputes that could be resolved with stern warnings and community service. But March 15, 1980, had changed everything, not just for the families who lost children, but for every person in law enforcement who had to live with the knowledge that sometimes evil wins and justice remains forever out of reach, leaving only questions that multiply like cancer cells in the dark. His grandfather had been a miner at Copper Ridge, working the deep shafts that extracted silver and copper ore from the mountain's belly for 30 years, until black lung disease forced him into early retirement that left him wheezing and weak. But still proud of honest work that had fed his family and built the foundation for Marcus to pursue education and a career in law enforcement. The Blake family had deep roots in Millbrook, stretching back 4 generations to when the town was nothing more than a cluster of tents and dreams around a promising mining claim that would eventually support hundreds of families and create a community bound together by shared struggles and mutual dependence. The Millbrook of Marcus's childhood had been a place where neighbors helped each other without being asked, where children rode their bicycles until dark without fear, and where the biggest excitement was the annual Founders' Day festival that brought families together for pie contests and three-legged races and fireworks that lit up the mountain sky. But the disappearance had fractured that sense of safety and community, turning Millbrook into a place where people whispered behind closed doors and strangers were viewed with suspicion, and parents held their children closer while scanning crowds for faces that might belong to someone who could steal their most precious treasures. Marcus remembered being assigned to crowd control that terrible afternoon when parents began arriving at the school, demanding answers that no one could provide. He had watched Eleanor Walsh pace the parking lot like a caged animal, her hands shaking, as she clutched Jennifer's school photograph and repeated her daughter's name as if saying it enough times might somehow bring the little girl home safely. The raw panic in Eleanor's eyes had burned itself into Marcus's memory, becoming the driving force behind his decision to dedicate his career to finding justice for families who had been abandoned by a system that seemed more interested in protecting institutional reputations than discovering truth. The federal takeover of the investigation had been Marcus's first lesson in how power and politics could interfere with justice when FBI agents arrived and immediately classified evidence under national security protocols, effectively shutting out local law enforcement from their own case. Marcus had been ordered to stop asking questions about the mine closure and the military installations in the area, but those orders had only strengthened his resolve to someday find a way to reopen the investigation using resources and authority that he didn't possess as a rookie deputy, but might acquire through years of patient service and careful relationship building. Dr. Sarah Chen had moved to Millbrook in 1995 to establish a practice in child psychology specifically to help families cope with the long-term trauma of the disappearance. But her work had expanded to include anyone in the community who struggled with the persistent atmosphere of grief and uncertainty that seemed to hang over the town like morning fog that never quite lifted. She had met Marcus at a town council meeting where she was advocating for improved mental health services, and he was pushing for additional resources to keep the missing children case active. Their shared commitment to healing the community had grown into love and eventually marriage. But Sarah understood that she was sharing her husband with 27 ghosts who demanded his attention and loyalty in ways that living people couldn't compete with. The Millbrook Sheriff's Department occupied a modest brick building on Main Street that had been constructed in 1952 when the town's population was 3 times larger and the local economy was thriving from mining operations that employed hundreds of workers. The building's basement contained evidence storage rooms that Marcus had reorganized multiple times over the years, creating elaborate filing systems and cross-reference charts that tracked every piece of information related to the Bus 47 case, even the smallest details that other investigators might have dismissed as irrelevant, because Marcus believed that solving cold cases required obsessive attention to patterns and connections that might not become apparent until decades after the original investigation. Marcus had converted his home office into an unofficial command center for the missing children case, with detailed maps of the search area covering every wall and timelines that tracked the movements of every person who had been in contact with the children or the bus driver. On March 15, 1980, the room contained dozens of binders organized by category: witness statements, physical evidence, federal documents that had been declassified over the years, and correspondence with family members who continued to provide new information or request updates on the investigation, even 40 years after their children had vanished. The decision to run for sheriff in 2018 had been motivated primarily by Marcus's desire to gain the authority necessary to reopen the Bus 47 case using modern investigative techniques and technology that hadn't existed in 1980, when the original investigation was conducted. His campaign platform had focused on bringing closure to cold cases and ensuring that victim families received the attention and resources they deserved, rather than being forgotten when their tragedies were no longer front-page news. His victory had been decisive, with strong support from the families of the missing children and community members who wanted someone in charge who understood that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied. One of Marcus's first acts as sheriff had been to establish a cold case unit with Detective Lisa Rodriguez as its head, and a budget specifically allocated for advanced forensic analysis and investigative travel that might be required to pursue leads that crossed state or even national boundaries. The unit's primary focus was the Bus 47 case, but Marcus had made it clear that they would also review other unsolved crimes in the county, using fresh eyes and new technology to examine evidence that previous generations of investigators might have missed or misinterpreted due to limitations in available resources and scientific knowledge. The relationship between Marcus and Eleanor Walsh had evolved over 40 years, from professional courtesy to deep mutual respect, and eventually to something approaching a parent-child bond as Eleanor aged and her health declined. But her determination never wavered. Marcus visited her weekly at the assisted living facility where she had moved after David's death, bringing updates on the investigation and listening to her stories about Jennifer's personality and dreams and the life that had been stolen from her daughter Eleanor had made Marcus promise that he would never give up searching for answers, and he had given his word, knowing that breaking such a promise would be a betrayal not just of Eleanor, but of his own sense of purpose and identity. The mining families who had worked at Copper Ridge before its sudden closure in 1981 had maintained their own informal network of communication over the decades, sharing theories and suspicions about what had really happened to cause the mine to be sealed so quickly after the children disappeared. Many of these families had been forced to leave Millbrook when the mine closed, eliminating dozens of good-paying jobs and devastating the local economy. But those who remained had never forgotten their belief that the mine closure was connected to the missing children, and they had continued to share information with Marcus whenever something seemed relevant to the ongoing investigation. Marcus's daily routine included reviewing files from the Bus 47 case before starting his regular duties as sheriff, because he had learned that fresh perspectives often came from approaching familiar information with new questions or different assumptions about what might be significant. The case had become such an integral part of his identity that Sarah sometimes joked that he knew more about the missing children than he did about his own nephews and nieces. But she understood that his obsession was really a form of love, a refusal to let 27 young lives be forgotten or dismissed as acceptable losses in whatever larger conspiracy had resulted in their disappearance. The town council meetings in Millbrook had been dominated by discussions of the missing children case for 40 years, with family members and supporters regularly attending to ensure that the investigation remained a priority for local government. And law enforcement leaders. Marcus had attended every meeting since becoming sheriff, providing updates on new leads and reassuring the community that the case would never be considered closed until definitive answers were found. But he had also been honest about the challenges involved in investigating a case where key evidence had been classified or destroyed, and witnesses had died or disappeared over the course of 4 decades. The Memorial Garden had become a pilgrimage site for people from across the country who were interested in unsolved mysteries or who had experienced similar tragedies in their own communities. Marcus often encountered visitors who had traveled hundreds or thousands of miles to pay their respects to the missing children, and to leave flowers or small tokens of remembrance at the base of the memorial trees. These encounters reminded him that the Bus 47 case had become more than just a local tragedy, but a symbol of all the children who had been lost to violence or neglect, or systems that failed to protect the most vulnerable members of society. When the call came from the Copper Ridge mining site on October 12, 2020, Marcus had been reviewing the case files for what felt like the 1,000th time, searching for connections or patterns that he might have missed in previous examinations of the evidence. But the voice of mining engineer Carlos Rivera carried an urgency that made Marcus's heart race even before he heard the words that would change everything. They had found something in the sealed section of the mine, something that belonged to one of the missing children, and Marcus knew that after 40 years of waiting and searching and hoping the families of Millbrook were finally going to get some answers, even if those answers might be more disturbing than anyone had ever imagined. Eleanor Walsh had been 28 years old when Jennifer disappeared, a young mother who believed that love and vigilance could protect her child from every danger that the world might present. But 40 years of grief had transformed her into something both fragile and fierce, a woman whose every breath was dedicated to keeping her daughter's memory alive, while pursuing a truth that seemed to retreat further into shadow. With each passing decade, the small apartment at Millbrook Senior Living Center where Eleanor now resided was a shrine to Jennifer's brief life, with photographs covering every surface and Jennifer's favorite books still arranged on shelves as if waiting for small hands to reach for them again. Before becoming a mother, Eleanor had worked as an investigative reporter for the Denver Post, covering environmental issues and government accountability stories that required patience and persistence and an unwillingness to accept official explanations. When the evidence suggested more complex truths, those skills had served her well in the years following Jennifer's disappearance, when she found herself conducting her own investigation parallel to the official efforts that seemed hampered by bureaucratic obstacles and federal interference that made no sense unless someone with significant power had reasons to prevent the truth from being discovered. Jennifer Marie Walsh had been born on October 3, 1971, during one of those crisp autumn mornings when the aspens were turning gold and the air carried the promise of winter snows that would blanket the mountains in pristine silence. She had been a healthy baby with blonde hair and blue eyes that seemed to hold wisdom beyond her years. Eleanor often said that Jennifer had been born curious, always asking questions about how things worked and why people behaved the way they did and where butterflies went when winter came to the mountains. Her favorite book was Charlotte's Web, which Eleanor had read aloud so many times that both of them could recite entire passages from memory. The Walsh family had moved to Millbrook in 1978 when David got a job as an accountant for the mining company, and Eleanor found freelance work writing feature stories about small-town life for regional magazines. They had chosen Millbrook specifically because it seemed like the perfect place to raise children safely away from the urban problems that plagued larger cities, where crime and pollution and social dysfunction made parents worry constantly about their children's well-being. The irony of that decision would haunt Eleanor for the rest of her life, knowing that she had brought Jennifer to Millbrook seeking safety, only to lose her daughter in a way that would never have happened in any city where school buses didn't simply vanish without trace. David Walsh had served in Vietnam as a communications specialist, returning home with injuries both visible and hidden that made him appreciate the simple pleasures of civilian life and peaceful family routines that could be counted on to remain constant from one day to the next. He had met Eleanor at the University of Colorado, where she was studying journalism, and he was using his GI benefits to complete a degree in accounting. Their courtship had been brief but intense, built on shared values about honesty and hard work, and the importance of building something meaningful together that could withstand whatever challenges life might present. The morning routine in the Walsh household had been precisely choreographed around Jennifer's school schedule, with Eleanor preparing breakfast while David packed Jennifer's lunch and Jennifer herself choosing clothes and gathering homework assignments that needed to be turned. In that day, Jennifer had been responsible for feeding their cat Whiskers and watering the small herb garden that Eleanor maintained on the kitchen windowsill. These simple tasks had given Jennifer a sense of importance and contribution to the family's daily functioning, while teaching her that everyone had roles to play in maintaining a household that operated smoothly and lovingly. Jennifer's teacher, Mrs. Patricia Morrison, had described her as an exceptional student who excelled in reading and mathematics, but who also possessed unusual emotional intelligence that allowed her to befriend classmates who might otherwise have been excluded from social groups because of shyness or differences that children sometimes found threatening. Jennifer had a talent for drawing detailed pictures of animals and flowers that decorated the Walsh family refrigerator and filled several spiral notebooks that Eleanor still kept in Jennifer's bedroom, along with report cards that consistently praised her daughter's academic performance and kind nature. The bus driver, Ralph Morrison, had been Mrs. Morrison's husband, a coincidence that had made both Eleanor and Jennifer feel especially safe about the daily school commute, because they knew that Ralph would take extra care to ensure Jennifer's well-being. During the 20-minute ride from Millbrook Elementary to the residential neighborhood where the Walsh family lived, Ralph had driven school buses for 20 years without a single accident or disciplinary action, and children loved him because he knew all their names and asked about their pets and remembered their birthdays with small celebrations that made ordinary school days feel special. On the weekend before Jennifer disappeared, the Walsh family had visited Rocky Mountain National Park for an early spring hiking trip that Jennifer had been anticipating for weeks. She had packed her own backpack with snacks and a camera that David had given her for her 8th birthday, along with a journal where she planned to record observations about wildlife and interesting plants that they might encounter during their adventure. The photographs from that trip showed Jennifer grinning beside mountain streams and pointing excitedly at deer, grazing in meadows that stretched toward snow-capped peaks that seemed to touch the sky. Eleanor's investigation into Jennifer's disappearance had begun within hours of realizing that the school bus was missing, when official channels seemed inadequate to address the urgency of the situation. She had immediately begun calling other parents to compile a complete list of the missing children and their characteristics and any special needs or medical conditions that might be relevant to search efforts. Her journalistic training had taught her the importance of documenting everything and asking questions that others might overlook because they were too close to the situation to maintain objective perspective. The federal response to the disappearance had struck Eleanor as suspicious from the beginning, when FBI agents arrived with prepared statements about terrorism and kidnapping scenarios, but seemed uninterested in hearing detailed information about the children's personalities and routines and relationships that might provide clues about what had actually happened. Eleanor had attempted to schedule interviews with the lead federal investigator, Agent William Crawford, but her requests had been consistently denied, with explanations about ongoing investigations and national security considerations that made no sense in the context of missing elementary school children. David's reaction to Jennifer's disappearance had been completely different from Eleanor's approach to the crisis. While Eleanor channeled her grief into investigation and advocacy, David seemed to retreat into himself, becoming increasingly withdrawn and uncommunicative as weeks turned to months without any meaningful progress in finding their daughter. The different coping mechanisms had created tension in their marriage that eventually became insurmountable when David suggested that they should consider moving away from Millbrook and starting over somewhere that didn't contain constant reminders of their loss. The support group that formed among the families of the missing children had become Eleanor's primary source of emotional sustenance during the years when hope seemed to be the only thing preventing complete despair. The monthly meetings in the church basement had evolved into an informal network of mutual aid, where families shared resources and information and emotional support that helped them navigate the unique challenges of loving someone who might be alive somewhere, but unreachable and unknowable in ways that made traditional grief impossible because closure remained perpetually out of reach. Eleanor's relationship with her extended family had been strained by her refusal to accept that Jennifer was dead and move on with her life in ways that other people considered healthy and normal. Her sister Margaret had repeatedly suggested that Eleanor needed professional help to process her grief and begin rebuilding her life, but Eleanor rejected such advice because she believed that giving up hope would be a betrayal of Jennifer, who might still be alive somewhere waiting for her mother, to find her and bring her home safely. The private investigators that Eleanor had hired over the years had consumed most of her savings and David's life insurance money after his death from a heart attack in 1995 that Eleanor believed was caused by the stress of living with unresolved grief for 15 years. Some of the investigators had been competent professionals who had pursued legitimate leads, while others had been charlatans who exploited desperate families with false promises and fabricated evidence. But Eleanor had continued hiring them because doing something felt better than doing nothing, even when the results were consistently disappointing. Dr. Robert Chen had become an unlikely ally in Eleanor's quest for answers when his geological surveys of the Copper Ridge area revealed inconsistencies in official reports about the mine's structural condition and the reasons for its sudden closure in 1981. Dr. Chen had shared his findings with Eleanor because he believed that the families deserved to know about any potential connections between the mine closure and the missing children, even though such speculation could damage his professional reputation. If his colleagues viewed his involvement as inappropriate activism rather than scientific inquiry, the memorial garden had been Eleanor's idea, conceived during the 5th anniversary of the disappearance, when she realized that the community needed a physical place where people could gather to remember the children and demonstrate continuing commitment to finding answers. The fundraising effort had brought together people from across Colorado and beyond who contributed money and labor to create a beautiful space that honored the missing children while serving as a visible reminder that their cases remained unsolved and their families continued to seek justice. Eleanor's health had declined significantly in recent years, as the physical and emotional toll of 40 years of searching and advocating and hoping had weakened her body in ways that even her determined spirit couldn't overcome. She had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia that sometimes caused confusion about dates and details, but never affected her memory of Jennifer or her commitment to finding the truth about what had happened on March 15, 1980, when 27 children had been stolen from their families and hidden in ways that suggested resources and planning far beyond what ordinary criminals could accomplish. Sheriff Blake's weekly visits to Eleanor's apartment had become one of the few reliable sources of comfort in her increasingly difficult daily existence, because he was the only person in authority who still treated the case as an active investigation, rather than a historical tragedy that deserved sympathy but not ongoing resources. Eleanor had extracted a promise from Marcus that he would never stop searching for Jennifer and the other children even after Eleanor herself was gone, because someone needed to carry forward the responsibility of seeking truth and justice for families who had been failed by systems that should have protected their children. When Marcus called Eleanor on October 12, 2020, to tell her about the discovery at the mine, She had been sitting in her favorite chair, looking through Jennifer's photo albums, as she did every afternoon when the late sunlight streamed through. Her window in patterns that reminded her of the way light had fallen across Jennifer's hair during their last family hiking trip. Eleanor's hands had trembled as she held the phone, listening to Marcus describe finding Jennifer's backpack in a sealed chamber that shouldn't have existed, but the news had filled her with hope rather than despair, because finally, after 40 years of waiting, someone had found proof that her daughter had existed and that the truth was waiting to be discovered. In the darkness beneath Copper Ridge Mountain, the drive to the Copper Ridge mining site on October 12, 2020, had felt like a pilgrimage to Sheriff Marcus Blake as his patrol car wound through mountain roads that he had traveled countless times during 40 years of searching for answers, but never with the electric anticipation that now coursed through his veins, because finally, after 4 decades of dead ends and false leads and bureaucratic stonewalling, someone had found physical evidence that the missing children had been real. People with real possessions rather than just names on memorial plaques and fading photographs in evidence boxes that gathered dust in basement storage rooms. Detective Lisa Rodriguez had insisted on accompanying Marcus to the mine, despite having been scheduled for court testimony in an unrelated case, because she understood that this discovery represented the most significant development in the Bussy 47 investigation since the original disappearance, and she wanted to ensure that proper evidence protocols were followed from the moment they arrived at the site to prevent any possibility that crucial information might be contaminated or lost due to procedural errors that could compromise future prosecution efforts if the investigation ultimately revealed criminal activity. The Apex Industries mining operation had transformed the area around Copper Ridge, with modern equipment and temporary buildings that housed administrative offices and equipment storage facilities. But the actual mine entrance remained much as it had been in 1981, when the tunnels were sealed under circumstances that had never been adequately explained to the families who suspected that the closure was connected to their missing children. The contrast between the bustling modern operation and the abandoned sealed sections created an almost surreal atmosphere that reminded Marcus of archaeological sites where past and present coexisted uneasily. Carlos Rivera, the mining engineer who had discovered the hidden chamber, stood waiting at the mine entrance, wearing standard safety equipment that included a hard hat with mounted lighting and protective clothing designed for underground work. His expression combined professional excitement about an unusual geological discovery with obvious concern about the implications of finding a child's belongings in a space that had been sealed for nearly 4 decades. Carlos had worked mining operations across 3 states and had never encountered anything remotely similar to the deliberately concealed chamber that his team had uncovered during routine tunnel mapping. The mine entrance required special safety equipment that Apex Industries provided for Marcus and Detective Rodriguez, including hard hats, emergency breathing apparatus, and safety harnesses that would be essential if they encountered unstable tunnel conditions during their descent into the sealed sections where Jennifer Walsh's backpack had been discovered. The modern safety protocols represented a significant advancement over the equipment that had been available to search teams in 1980, when the original investigation was conducted using technology and techniques that now seemed primitive by comparison. Mine supervisor, Janet Kelly, had been briefed about the discovery by Carlos Rivera and had immediately contacted local law enforcement because she understood that finding a child's belongings in a sealed mine shaft raised serious questions about what had happened during the original closure in 1981. Janet had 25 years of experience managing mining operations and had never encountered a situation where evidence of missing persons was discovered in areas that should have been thoroughly Surveyed before closure, she was particularly concerned about potential liability issues for Apex Industries if the discovery led to revelations about criminal activity that had been concealed by previous mine operators. The descent into the mine followed standard safety procedures, with Carlos Rivera leading the way through tunnels that had been carved from living rock by previous generations of miners who had extracted millions of dollars worth of silver and copper ore from deposits that extended deep into the mountain. The tunnel walls showed evidence of both historical mining techniques and more recent survey work that Apex Industries had conducted to assess the feasibility of resuming operations. In areas that had been considered exhausted when the mine was originally closed. Dr. Sarah Chen had arrived at the mine site shortly after receiving a call from Marcus, requesting her assistance as a psychological consultant who could help interpret any evidence that might provide insights into the children's mental state or experiences during whatever ordeal they had endured before disappearing. Sarah's expertise in childhood trauma and her familiarity with the missing children case made her uniquely qualified to assess any personal items or written materials that might be discovered in the hidden chamber, though she privately feared that such evidence might reveal suffering that would be difficult for the families to process even 40 years after their initial loss. The modern lighting equipment that Apex Industries used for underground operations illuminated tunnel sections that had been dark for nearly 4 decades, revealing rock formations and mining artifacts that provided glimpses into the mountains, geological history, and the human efforts to extract its mineral wealth. The tunnels themselves were surprisingly well preserved, despite their age, with support structures that remained intact and air circulation systems that had prevented the accumulation of dangerous gases that could pose threats to anyone entering the sealed areas. Marcus felt a profound sense of anticipation mixed with dread as they approached the location where Jennifer's backpack had been discovered, because he knew that whatever they found in the hidden chamber would fundamentally change the investigation and might finally provide answers that the families had been seeking for 4 decades. But he also understood that those answers might reveal truths that were more disturbing than anyone had imagined during years of speculation about what could cause 27 children to vanish without leaving any trace of their fate. The sealed wall that Carlos Rivera's team had breached appeared to have been constructed with deliberate intent to conceal the chamber behind it, using techniques and materials that suggested professional knowledge of mining operations and structural engineering. Rather than amateur efforts to hide evidence, the precision of the concealment work indicated that whoever had sealed the chamber possessed both the skills and resources necessary to create a hiding place that could remain undetected for decades, even during professional surveys of the tunnel system. Detective Rodriguez documented every aspect of the sealed chamber using digital photography and detailed measurements that would be essential for creating accurate reconstructions of the scene and for supporting any future legal proceedings that might result from the investigation. Her training in crime scene analysis had taught her to pay attention to details that might seem insignificant initially but could prove crucial when the complete picture of events began to emerge through careful examination of all available evidence. The chamber itself was larger than the initial survey had indicated, extending approximately 20 feet into the mountain with a ceiling height that would have allowed adults to stand upright. While moving through the space, the walls showed evidence of tool marks that suggested the chamber had been carved specifically for its intended purpose, rather than being a natural cave formation that had been adapted for concealment. The floor was covered with fine sediment that had accumulated over decades, but which also contained artifacts that would require careful excavation and analysis. Jennifer's backpack had been positioned near what appeared to be the main entrance to the chamber, suggesting that it might have been left there deliberately as a message or marker, rather than being randomly discarded. The placement was too precise to be accidental, and the condition of the backpack indicated that it had been protected from moisture and other environmental factors that should have caused significant deterioration over 4 decades in an underground environment. The preservation suggested that the chamber had been sealed in ways that created controlled atmospheric conditions. The initial examination of the backpack revealed that it contained items that shouldn't have existed, including photographs that appeared to have been taken after March 15, 1980, and handwritten notes that bore dates from weeks and months following. The disappearance, these discoveries, challenged every assumption that investigators had made about the timeline of events and suggested that at least some of the missing children had survived for extended periods after vanishing from the school, thus creating new questions about what had happened to them and why evidence of their survival had been concealed for 40 years. Marcus recognized that the discovery represented both an opportunity and a potential problem, because while the evidence might finally provide answers about the missing children, it could also attract unwanted attention from federal agencies that had interfered with the original investigation and might attempt to classify new findings under national security protocols that would prevent local law enforcement from pursuing justice for the families who had waited 4 decades for answers. The political implications of the discovery were as complex as the investigative challenges it presented. The chamber contained additional items that would require careful cataloging and analysis, including children's clothing, personal belongings, and what appeared to be makeshift furniture constructed from mining materials and scrap wood. The evidence suggested that the chamber had been used as a living space for extended periods, rather than simply being a hiding place for bodies or discarded belongings. This revelation fundamentally altered the nature of the investigation from a missing persons case to something far more complex and disturbing. Dr. Chen's preliminary assessment of the evidence suggested that the children had been held in the chamber under controlled conditions that indicated careful planning and ongoing supervision, rather than random violence or opportunistic crime. The organization and preservation of personal items implied that someone had been managing the situation with specific goals that might not become clear until additional evidence was discovered and analyzed using techniques that had not been available during the original investigation in 1980. The presence of air circulation equipment that appeared to have been installed specifically to support human habitation in the chamber indicated that whoever had created this underground facility possessed both technical knowledge and financial resources that exceeded what typical criminals could access, suggesting that the disappearance of the school bus might have been connected to larger conspiracies or institutional activities that required significant coordination and cover-up capabilities. To maintain secrecy for 4 decades, as Marcus examined the evidence in the hidden chamber, he realized that Jennifer Walsh's backpack was only the beginning of discoveries that would challenge everything that Millbrook had believed about the disappearance of 27 children, and would ultimately expose truths that some people had apparently been willing to kill to protect the chamber, represented not just a crime scene, but a doorway into secrets that had been buried as deeply as the mountain could conceal them, and finding those secrets would require courage that Marcus wasn't certain he possessed, despite 40 years of preparation for this moment. Dr. Harrison Whitmore's phone rang at precisely 4:30 in the morning on October 13, 2020, but the retired federal scientist had been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of his Bethesda, Maryland home, knowing that this call would eventually come because 40 years of keeping secrets had taught him that the past never stays buried forever, no matter how deep you try to hide it. The voice on the other end belonged to someone he hadn't spoken to in decades, but whose authority overclassified. Operations had never diminished, despite official retirements and public denials of involvement in activities that violated every moral boundary that civilized society had established to protect innocent children. The conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, but its implications would ripple through government corridors and military installations across the country, as word spread that the Millbrook incident had been compromised by mining operations that should never have been permitted to resume in areas where national security assets remained buried beneath tons of rock and concrete barriers that had been constructed to ensure that certain experiments would never be exposed to public scrutiny or congressional oversight that could destroy careers and topple administrations if the truth about what had happened to those children ever reached the wrong people. General William Patterson had been a colonel in 1980 when Operation Mindbridge had been approved by committees that operated in shadows so deep that their existence was known only to a handful of individuals whose security clearances exceeded levels that most government employees never knew existed. The project had been designed to test psychological conditioning techniques on subjects whose disappearance would generate maximum emotional response from target populations, allowing researchers to study how communities reacted to unexplained trauma and whether such reactions could be weaponized for strategic advantages in psychological warfare operations. The selection of Millbrook, Colorado as a test site had been carefully calculated based on demographic studies that identified the community as an ideal laboratory for studying how isolated populations processed collective trauma when traditional support systems proved inadequate to address losses that couldn't be explained or resolved through normal investigative procedures. The town's geographic isolation and dependence on industries that could be easily manipulated through federal regulatory pressure had made it perfect for containing information and controlling narrative development during critical phases of the experiment. Agent Crawford had been the public face of the federal response to the bus disappearance, but his real role had been to manage information flow and ensure that local law enforcement remained focused on conventional explanations for the missing children, while diverting attention away from military installations and research facilities that operated under cover identities designed to appear as routine government operations rather than experimental programs that pushed ethical boundaries beyond anything that Congress or the American people would have tolerated if they had known the truth about what their tax dollars were funding. The children had been selected not randomly, but through careful analysis of family structures, psychological profiles, and community connections that would maximize the emotional impact of their disappearance while minimizing the risk that parents or relatives possess the resources or political connections necessary to conduct independent investigations that might uncover evidence of federal involvement in their abduction. The selection process had taken months of surveillance and background research conducted by teams of analysts who specialized in identifying vulnerable targets for experimental programs. Dr. Whitmore's role in Operation Mindbridge had been to develop pharmaceutical compounds that could be used to modify memory and behavior in test subjects, allowing researchers to study the long-term effects of psychological manipulation on developing minds while maintaining plausible deniability about the source of any lasting trauma that subjects might experience. The drugs had been designed to create amnesia about specific events while leaving other memories intact, creating confusion and uncertainty that would make it impossible for subjects to provide coherent testimony about their experiences, even if they were eventually discovered. The underground facility at Copper Ridge had been constructed during the 1970s under the cover of routine mining operations, with funding channeled through Defense Department contracts that appeared to be related to mineral extraction and geological surveys, but were actually used to create a secure location where experimental subjects could be held for extended periods without risk of discovery by local authorities or federal agencies that weren't cleared for access to classified operations. The facility had been designed to be completely self-contained, with life support systems and communication equipment that operated independently of civilian infrastructure. The decision to terminate Operation Mindbridge in 1981 had been driven by political changes in Washington that made continued funding impossible, and by growing concerns among project administrators that the psychological conditioning techniques being tested were producing unexpected side effects that could compromise the long-term viability of the research program. The children had become too psychologically damaged to provide reliable data, and several had developed medical conditions that required treatment beyond what the facility could provide without attracting unwanted attention from medical professionals. General Patterson's current position as Director of Special Projects for the Pentagon gave him access to resources and personnel that could be deployed to protect national security interests when classified operations were threatened by unauthorized disclosure. But 40 years of technological advancement had made it increasingly difficult to control information and suppress investigations that could expose historical crimes committed in the name of national defense. The discovery at Copper Ridge represented a threat that required immediate action to prevent catastrophic damage to institutions and individuals who had served their country in ways that the public could never be allowed to understand. The elimination protocols that had been developed for situations where classified operations faced exposure included provisions for removing evidence and neutralizing threats to operational security using methods that would appear to be accidents or natural causes rather than deliberate interventions designed to protect state secrets. Dr. Whitmore had participated in the development of these protocols during his years as a government scientist, but had never imagined that he might someday become a target for elimination if his knowledge of classified activities became a liability rather than an asset. Agent Crawford's death in a car accident in 1995 had been the first indication that someone was systematically removing individuals who possessed detailed knowledge of Operation Mindbridge and similar programs that had operated during the Cold War era, when ethical oversight was minimal and congressional supervision was virtually non-existent. The accident had appeared genuine to local investigators, but Dr. Whitmore recognized the signature characteristics of professional elimination that left no traces of deliberate intervention while ensuring that dangerous knowledge died with its possessors. The phone call that awakened Dr. Whitmore had included specific instructions about steps he needed to take to protect himself and his family from individuals who might attempt to extract information about classified operations through methods that didn't respect conventional legal boundaries or constitutional protections. The caller had made it clear that Dr. Whitmore's cooperation in maintaining operational security was not optional, and that failure to comply with directives would result in consequences that extended beyond his own personal safety to include family members who had no knowledge of his government service. Sheriff Blake's investigation represented a direct threat to national security interests that had been protected for 4 decades through careful management of information and strategic intervention in local affairs whenever civilian authorities came too close to discovering evidence of federal involvement in activities that violated domestic and international laws governing human experimentation and the treatment of civilian populations during peacetime operations. The discovery of physical evidence in the sealed chamber had created an immediate crisis that required decisive action to prevent exposure of classified programs. Sheriff Marcus Blake had barely returned to his office from the mine site when the first federal vehicle arrived in Millbrook unannounced and without the courtesy of prior notification that professional courtesy typically demanded between law Enforcement agencies, the black SUV with government plates, pulled into the parking lot of the Millbrook Sheriff's Department at exactly 3:15 in the afternoon, carrying agents whose credentials identified them as Department of Homeland Security investigators, but whose true purpose remained deliberately vague when they requested immediate access to all evidence collected from the Copper Ridge mining site, including Jennifer Walsh's backpack and any photographs or documentation that had been created during the investigation. Agent Patricia Morrison presented herself as the lead investigator for a federal task force examining potential national security implications of the discovery. But her explanation for federal interest in a 40-year-old missing persons case seemed rehearsed and inadequate to address the obvious questions about why children's belongings found in an abandoned mine shaft would trigger involvement from agencies that typically dealt with terrorism and border security rather than local criminal investigations. Marcus had encountered federal overreach before during his career, but never with such immediate response to evidence that had been discovered less than 24 hours earlier, suggesting that someone had been monitoring the situation and was prepared to intervene the moment that classified materials were threatened with exposure. The tension in Marcus's office was palpable as Agent Morrison explained that the federal government had compelling evidence that the Copper Ridge area had been used for activities related to national defense during the 1980s, and that any materials discovered in the sealed sections of the mine might contain information that could compromise ongoing security operations if disclosed to unauthorized personnel. Her assertion that local law enforcement lacked the security clearances necessary to properly handle such evidence struck Marcus as both insulting and suspicious, because missing children should not require national security protocols unless their disappearance was connected to federal activities that someone was desperate to keep hidden from public scrutiny. Detective Rodriguez had been documenting the evidence from the hidden chamber when Agent Morrison demanded that all materials be transferred to federal custody immediately without allowing local investigators to complete their preliminary analysis or create copies for their own files. The federal agent's urgency seemed disproportionate to the nature of the evidence, and her reluctance to explain the specific national security concerns raised red flags for Marcus, who had learned during 4 decades in law enforcement to be suspicious of officials who demanded compliance without providing adequate justification for their authority or their actions. Dr. Sarah Chen had been scheduled to conduct psychological analysis of the handwritten notes found in Jennifer's backpack, but Agent Morrison declared that such analysis was prohibited under federal regulations governing classified materials, and that any civilian who had already been exposed to the evidence would need to sign non-disclosure agreements that carried criminal penalties for violations. Marcus realized that the federal response was designed not to investigate the missing children, but to suppress any evidence that might reveal what had actually happened to them during the 40 years since their disappearance, creating a cover-up that prioritized institutional protection over justice for families who had suffered unimaginable losses. The confrontation escalated when Marcus refused to surrender the evidence without proper legal documentation, including warrants or court orders that would provide constitutional authority for federal seizure of materials related to a local criminal. Investigations Agent Morrison's response revealed the true nature of her mission when she cited national security statutes that effectively suspended normal legal protections and constitutional rights whenever federal agencies determined that classified information was at risk of unauthorized disclosure. The law she referenced had been designed to combat foreign espionage, not to protect government agencies from accountability for historical crimes against American citizens. Eleanor Walsh arrived at the sheriff's office while Agent Morrison was demanding custody of Jennifer's backpack. unaware that federal agents were attempting to seize the first concrete evidence of her daughter's fate that had been discovered in 40 years of searching. Eleanor's reaction to learning that the government wanted to classify her daughter's belongings as state secrets was a mixture of outrage and heartbreak that reflected 4 decades of frustration with official obstacles that had prevented her from learning the truth about Jennifer's disappearance. Her demand to examine her daughter's backpack before it was taken away created a standoff that forced Agent Morrison to reveal the callous indifference that federal agencies felt toward families whose children had been sacrificed for classified operations. The legal authority that Agent Morrison claimed for seizing evidence was based on executive orders and classified directives that had never been subject to congressional oversight or judicial review, creating a shadow legal system that operated outside constitutional constraints whenever national security was invoked to justify actions that would otherwise be recognized as criminal violations of civil rights. Marcus understood that challenging federal authority would require resources and political support that a small-town sheriff couldn't realistically expect to obtain, but he also knew that surrendering the evidence without a fight would betray the trust that Eleanor Walsh and 26 other families had placed in him. To seek justice for their missing children, the standoff continued for 3 hours as Agent Morrison made increasingly threatening statements about the consequences that Marcus and his department would face if they continued to obstruct federal operations, while Marcus insisted that local law enforcement had jurisdiction over crimes committed within county boundaries, regardless of any national security implications. That federal agencies might claim the dispute revealed fundamental conflicts between constitutional law enforcement and the expanded powers that intelligence agencies had assumed since the September 11th attacks, creating a confrontation that neither side could resolve through normal channels. Dr. Whitmore's arrival at the sheriff's office shortly before 6 o'clock represented an unexpected development that changed the dynamics of the confrontation because his security clearances and knowledge of classified operations gave him authority to examine evidence that other federal officials had declared off-limits to local investigators. His calm demeanor and professional credentials initially suggested that he might provide a reasonable resolution to the dispute, but his true purpose became clear when he began asking detailed questions about what Marcus had discovered in the hidden chamber and whether any other evidence might exist that could threaten operations that remained classified after 40 years. The revelation that Dr. Whitmore had been directly involved in the disappearance of the 27 children came when Eleanor Walsh recognized his voice as belonging to someone she had spoken with briefly during the chaotic first week after. Jennifer vanished when he had called their home, claiming to be a federal investigator, gathering background information about Jennifer's personality and medical history for the search effort. Eleanor's identification of Dr. Whitmore as someone who had possessed detailed knowledge about Jennifer within days of her disappearance exposed him as a participant in whatever conspiracy had resulted in the children being taken to the underground facility at Copper Ridge. The confrontation reached its climax when Dr. Whitmore attempted to justify the federal seizure of evidence by explaining that the missing children had been subjects in classified research programs designed to protect national security during the Cold War era, when such operations were considered necessary to defend American interests against foreign threats. His clinical description of the children as experimental subjects rather than victims revealed the dehumanizing mindset that had enabled federal scientists and military officials to treat American children as expendable resources in pursuit of strategic advantages that were never clearly defined or ethically justified. Marcus's decision to arrest Dr. Whitmore for conspiracy in the disappearance of 27 children created a constitutional crisis that would ultimately require intervention from federal courts to resolve. But his action also demonstrated that local law enforcement retained some authority to challenge federal overreach when constitutional rights were being violated and when evidence of historical crimes was being suppressed to protect institutional interests rather than legitimate. National security concerns. The arrest represented both a victory for justice and the beginning of a legal battle that would test whether American democracy could hold government officials accountable for crimes committed under the cover of classified operations. The story of the missing children of Millbrook continues to unfold as investigators work to uncover the full scope of the conspiracy that led to their disappearance and the cover-up that protected their captors for 4 decades. But Jennifer Walsh's backpack has already provided enough evidence to begin the process of seeking justice for families who never stopped believing that someday the truth would emerge from the darkness where it had been hidden. The discovery represents hope not just for the families of Millbrook, but for all Americans who believe that government power must be constrained by constitutional law and moral principles that protect the innocent from those who would sacrifice children for abstract concepts of national security. If this story has moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share it with others who believe that truth and justice are worth fighting for, no matter how long it takes to achieve them.